We continue our discussion on the health hazards in Jagersfontein. We're joined by Professor Anthony Turton from the Centre for Environmental Management at the University of the Free State. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. One cannot deny that urgent intervention is needed in Jagersfontein. In terms of scale, I mean, we're learning about the the toxic chemicals as well as the depth on the impact of the spill. What are we looking at when it comes to the environmental hazards?
Yes, good morning this is a very emotive topic, and one has to be very cautious, when dealing with such a high level of emotion, because the facts are not always necessarily consistent with that. While it's a serious tragedy and there's a loss of life, and absolutely a tragedy for the loss of livelihoods, I think this is really the major consequence of this thing. But the toxicity of diamond tailings I think is being exaggerated by many people. The simple reality is that different minerals that are mined have got different chemical compositions, and therefore there's a different process for each mineral to remove that from the host ore body in which it's found. And in the case of diamonds, to the best of my knowledge, very few, if any, chemicals are used in the process. In fact, the diamond recovery process is a mechanical one, and it makes use of a number of the physical properties of diamonds compared to other rocks. But it's not a chemical-based one. Unlike gold, gold makes use, for example, of cyanide, and cyanide remains as a residue in the tailings, for the rest of the life of the mine. So we've got to be very careful not to exaggerate this thing. It's in my professional opinion, the biggest risk is an environmental health risk rather than a human health risk. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't human casualties. Of course there are, and I think the biggest casualty there is the livelihoods. But ultimately it comes down to the environmental impact, I think, is of far greater significance than in terms of health than the human health hazard.
What about the spill and how it's demolished local sewage works, meaning that raw sewage is essentially floating in the area?
Oh, yes, sewage is another matter. Sewage is completely, that in my opinion, sewage is probably our biggest single national catastrophe at the moment. And I would say we're actually dealing with two issues here within this broad spectrum. The first issue I would zoom out to say that it's really about the post-mining era. How do we deal with long-term residues of mining, of which South African landscape is littered, from gold to platinum to diamonds, you name it. Copper, we've got all of those residues all over the country, and in many cases we've reached the end of the life of the mining operation, or we're approaching the end of the life. So the transition to the post-closure phase is now of great importance. So that's one set of issues, and I think that's a very, very important set of issues that need to be discussed. But the second set of issues now, I think, is the probably numerically the biggest single risk we have in the country, and that is the risk of sewage. Virtually every single river in the country is polluted by raw sewage. And in your sewage, you've got every conceivable type of pathogen, virus, you name it, a bug you can think of. It's all in your raw sewage. And in fact, we are probably breeding the next generation of multi-drug resistant pathogens as a result of our persistent exposure to the sewage. So that, to me, the sewage problem is a serious, serious problem. That's our immediate short-term crisis. The mine residue area is more of a longer-term issue, a very important issue, but it's more a strategic issue, whereas the sewage crisis, in my opinion, is more of an immediate tactical issue. If you just weigh it up in terms of numbers, we don't want to reduce the value of a human life just to a number, but just to try and get some sort of sense of scale here. If we talk about numbers, the number of people that are at direct risk of, for example, in this particular Jagersfontein tragedy, is relatively small compared to the number of people that are at direct risk from exposure to sewage works. That's a completely different order of magnitude. And then if we go back into the tailings issue, if we look at the number of people that were exposed to hazard from the Jagersfontein spill compared to the number of people that are exposed on a daily basis, to the gold tailings in the Witwatersrand goldfields, that's completely another order of magnitude as well. So we just got to understand that we must prioritize these risks, and we've got to allocate our government resources, and our policy responses ought to be allocated according to the overall hazard rating of each of these things.
Just going back to the toxicity levels, and you saying that it's not as dramatic as made out to. What then, perhaps explain in layman's term, what is being spoken of when they speak about slime dam damage, and also how Minister Gwera Mantashe, as he went to Jagersfontein, said that the mining company had perhaps downplayed the acidity levels within the area?
Well, yes, acidity is a known factor when you're dealing with tailings. But acidity is not toxicity. See, we've got to be very precise in the wording that we use here, because if we want to come about with a policy response, we've got to be very precise in what we're talking about. So typically your mine residues have got some or other acidity-related factor involved. Your pyritic ore bodies, there'll be ore bodies that have got pyrite in it, tend to be acid-generating on their own. Diamond ore bodies are known as kimberlite. They are not really known for, they don't have any pyrite in them, and therefore they're not acid generating ones. So tailings are specific to the mineral being mined, and the tailings that you get from a diamond process differs fundamentally from the tailings from other processes. However, there are also similarities, and the similarity in both is that the tailings particles are extremely small. They're ground up in a mill process, and because they're so small, they don't have any structural stability. So all tailings dams, irrespective of what is in them, is generally structurally unstable, and therefore you have to manage that thing in perpetuity. And this is the big issue, because you've got to manage in perpetuity. While the mine is operating, you have a responsible person with equipment, with budget, that's able to do the daily maintenance needed. But then once that mine closes down, there's a shift or transfer in responsibility, and that's where things go wrong, because you get different kinds of hazards on your mine dumps at different periods of the life cycle of the mine dump. I can go into it in greater detail, but just to give you two broad examples now, just to try and get the public to sort of understand the context that we're talking about. If you're talking about an old mine residue, let's say, for example, some of the gold tailings dams that were laid down 100 years ago. So those tailing dams, while they are structurally unstable, they don't have sludge inside them anymore. The sludge has been dewatered, so the particles have all compacted and settled out. So they are relatively stable on condition that they are not allowed to overtop. In other words, on the top of the flat top of the dam, of the dump is a dam. And if that is not maintained properly, from a rainstorm event, you can get an overtopping. So that's one issue that you
Professor Turton, perhaps let me interrupt you very quickly, just for the sake of time. If we could maybe speak now about some of the urgent solutions that are needed to prevent the slimes and untreated sewage from reaching the dams before it starts raining.
Yes, I think this is a big issue. We're going into the rainy season now. So there are two issues that you mentioned there, the rainfall and the sewage. Those are two separate issues. We need to separate them. In my view, the sewage issue is a national crisis. We really need to prioritize that. And the second thing is the rainfall falling on the dumps. We have to manage that in the short term. And the only way to do that is for each mining operation to take care of their own area of responsibility. And of course, where those operations have been handed over to the state because the mine is closed, then the state has got that responsibility. So those are two totally different types of interventions. They require different skills and different resources in each case.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for your analysis there. Professor Anthony Turton, Centre for Environmental Management at the University of the Free State, speaking